The 1980s, the second half in particular, have been marked by an internally directed saturation campaign of government propaganda designed to condition the American public to enlist in what has come to be called the war on drugs. Not only our families and neighborhoods, but the country itself, it is said with drumbeat regularity, is imperiled by massive influx of drugs such as cocaine. Unless we combat them with every means at our collective disposal, it is claimed, drug lords and narco-terrorists will surely destroy the fabric of our society. Overall, there has been precious little critical scrutiny of the government's claims as to the real nature and extent of the contemporary drug problem in the United States, nor to its origins. To the contrary, the mainstream population, with its oft-remarked and truly peculiar blend of jingoism and compulsive need to target its emotional attention upon some great Satan, has responded with gusto, undoubtedly exceeding the propagandist's fondest imaginings, converting the whole thing into something of a holy war, queuing up to do battle on the borders of some mystical moral frontier. Attendant to broad public acceptance of the supposed fact that the need for such a war exists has come popular endorsement of spiraling appropriations to proliferating police power, both in terms of personnel and in terms of equipage, and the concomitant acquiescence in the general application of outright police state techniques. And there's a whole list of examples that can be gone into to illustrate that particular point. I'll run through only a few of them here. The formation and deployment of what amounts to commando units in virtually every U.S. city with a population greater than 20,000. That includes Boulder, Colorado. Compliments of Alex Hunter and the local police commissioners. Warrantless, no-knock entry of private premises. A dramatic increase in electronic and other forms of police surveillance of the citizenry. Use of infiltrators and agents provocateurs in what are commonly called sting operations. Random and arbitrary stop and search of individuals along the nation's streets and highways, state impoundment of personal property without due process, compulsory urinalysis and other violations of constitutional protections against self-incrimination and unreasonable search and seizure, systematic denial of bail to nearly a third of all federal arrestees under the Preventive Detention Clause of the so-called Bail Reform Act of 1984. Please deliver me from any more reforms of that sort. And prosecution under impossibly vague statutes such as the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, or RICO Act. A marked diminishment in the evidentiary requirements leading to prosecution and conviction has been a major judicial contribution to the war effort, a matter which is coupled to the imposition of, quote, stiffer, end quote, prison sentences upon those found guilty of selling or consuming various herbs or white powders, and an escalating use of the death penalty where defendants can be shown to have engaged in what they call drug-related violence, or who can be described as drug kingpins, which I suggest is a rather ambiguous term at best. The social consensus is formed demanding more, not less of the same. Corresponding to all this have been increasingly insistent official demands for greater quantities of jail and prison space in order to warehouse the vastly increasing numbers of persons caught up in the surging uses of police. Ronald Reagan, George Bush, and a number of other prominent establishmentarians, and that word is taken in the sense that they identify themselves as being the establishment in the interests of what can be defined as establishment. They've gone on record loudly and repeatedly calling for a doubling of the available number of prison beds during the 1990s. By and large, the public response has been to echo their cries to get the criminals off the streets, appealing to one another for more concrete and bars, willingly handing over tax dollars and agreeing to massive bond issues in order to erect ever more cages to hold ever more human beings. The trend in this regard and certain of the societal consequences attached to it are exemplified in the state of Colorado, where resources available for such things as education, child care, environmental protection, and mass transit have been eroded steadily in terms of real dollar values by what they call a soggy economy. Meanwhile, allocations for police and prisons have risen sharply, also in real dollar terms. Although seldom commented upon, this cause and effect relationship is hardly a mirage. Rather, it is an adjustment of priorities from an emphasis upon social progressivism, no matter how diluted, to social regimentation, an assignment of value typically associated with fascism and other forms of totalitarian socio-political organization. Also left unsaid amidst all the clamor is the fact that the United States already leads the industrialized world in terms of the proportion of its aggregate population it incarcerates. By 1983, with an incarceration rate of under 200 per 100,000, the U.S. was already well established for first place in this regard. Today, the rate is 263. By way of comparison, second place is held by Austria with a rate of 114 per 100,000, well under half the U.S. standard. The rate of West Germany is 100.3, Great Britain 87, Netherlands 28. Reputedly, the incarceration rate of the USSR, much decried as a literal epitome of totalitarianism by such astute political observers as Reagan and Jeane Kirkpatrick. It's going to be a good crowd. Was 197 per 100,000 in 1987. And that's also obviously well below the level evidenced in the United States. It is perhaps true that certain third world countries, primarily U.S. client states, I might add, still show an incarceration rate higher than that of the U.S. That's when they just don't kill the people that they want to move out of the way. Simple arithmetic, however, reveals that if official plans for expansion of the North American penal system during the 90s are consummated, the next century will open with a U.S. incarceration rate of 536 per 100,000, a figure surpassing the normative standards set by even the worst third world regimes. It is now well within our collective destiny to become the most imprisoned people on earth, inhabiting a prison system which is truly of, by, and for the people. Well, some people in any event, okay? The prisons are, after all, being expanded primarily to accommodate those convicted of what they call drug-related offenses. And as anyone prone to watching epic TV series like Cops and DEA, and there's a number of others that have sprouted up in the last 12 months, are perfectly aware, persons fitting this category, that is drug offenders, are overwhelmingly black or Latino in makeup. All you have to do is turn on the tube and you'll find that out. Such projections correspond very well with certain real-world data. For instance, in 1980, when African Americans made up approximately 11% of the aggregate U.S. population, the black proportion of the U.S. prison population was 44% and rising. Today, the figure is a little under 55% and still rising. The present incarceration rate for Afro-Americans is more than 6 times the national average and rising. The weight of this falls upon black males between ages 18 and 25. At their current rate of incarceration, 1 in every 4 young black men will be doing, or in some cases, a number of cases, has already done, prison time by the end of the present decade. As a group, they stand almost exactly twice the risk of imprisonment that they would if they were residents of apartheid South Africa. Okay? And this is at current levels. Given that their proportion is steadily increasing within an overall prison population which is itself scheduled to double over the next 10 years, it may be predicted that by the year 2000, assuming the official posture prevails, as there's every reason to expect it will unless some drastic change occurs, more than half of all black men in the United States will do prison time. The negative impact of this upon the African American community is already incalculable. Although generalities, everything from the destabilization of community, social, and political organizations and institutions to the much touted disintegration of the black family are well known. Well known, even if usually taken out of context, okay? They're not talked about in a context which allows it to assign the actual social meaning which these things entail. In any event, it takes no Einstein to figure out things are slated to become much worse in this regard. And that's the implication of the doubling of the prison beds. Much worse. From this perspective, it is easy enough to discern that what is passed off as a war on drugs is actually more of a war upon the black community. Although not specifically on the black community. It's targeted, but not exclusively so. And there's data that's indicating now that there's a greater correlation to certain economic factors than there are to racial factors. It just so happens that there's a race correlation to poverty. And if you happen to be a person of any ethnic group in the United States who experiences the kind of endemic poverty which is experienced broadly in the black community, your proportionate rate of incarceration may be very nearly equally as high. So if you're poor, they've got a place for you. But overall, I think it's fair to say that what we're really dealing with, first and foremost, is a war upon communities of color. That would be a more accurate descriptor. And I think that's true insofar as Latinos, American Indians, and certain sectors of the Asian American community also tend to experience disproportionately high rates of imprisonment, with all the negative social and economic consequences this entails. As is the case with the Afro-Americans, the situation of these communities may be anticipated to deteriorate sharply in direct correspondence to the proliferation of U.S. police power and expansion of prison facilities which accompany the war on drugs. The question is, of course, why such a war has been undertaken. And I think there's some answers to that. And it's not because there's a bunch of bad guys out there that William Bennett's been invested with a moral crusade to track down, okay? The short answer goes to the steep decline of U.S. economic position relative to both Japan and Western Europe in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Essentially bankrupted by its military adventurism in Southeast Asia, the U.S. lost much of its competitive edge in the global marketplace, a matter which has led inexorably to its present status as a debtor nation. Simultaneously, the victory of the Vietnamese diminished U.S. ability to engage in the credible military projection integral to its function as a neocolonial power. Now, what this adds up to is that the status quo in this country over the past 20 years has been confronted with a diminishment of the revenues accruing from both its accustomed share of the global market, that is, externally generated revenues, and the super profits deriving from its exploitation of the third world. It's also externally generated, but you have profits, profit share and super profit share, both in decline. And from that, the North American status quo has no real alternative, or has perceived itself as having no real alternative if it wants to remain in the game, but to compensate internally through a significant redistribution of domestic wealth. This, as first Reagan and now Bush have been happy to show us, has meant the wholesale expropriation of the very limited assets attained, proportionately speaking, by working people from the end of World War II onward, and their consolidation in the hands of the richest 3% of this society. More specifically, however, it meant imposing a significantly greater degree of poverty among the very poorest sectors of U.S. society, the internal colonies, for lack of a better term, and I think actually that's a pretty good one. This is to say, a strata amounting to some 25% of the population composed primarily of people of color. The African American population, being the largest such group, has been particularly hard hit and thus serves as a primary example of the phenomenon at issue. For those interested in the details of the declining black income, employment, living standards, and other such indices which have accompanied this trend since 1970, and it began that long ago, I recommend Manning Marable's Race, Reform, and Rebellion, which you can probably pick up at the bookstore in this campus. I'm not sure. I'm not here this semester. Suffice it to say for the moment that the conditions of Afro-American impoverishment have now reached such a pass that in some predominantly black communities, South Bronx and Harlem come readily to mind, but there's a number of comparable examples that could be drawn on, life expectancy is shorter than were the residents to live in Bangladesh. Okay, now think about that and let that one soak in for a minute. Again, it's not specific just to blacks, okay? Conditions on American Indian reservations are just as bad in many cases. Like, Navajo has a 42.6-year life expectancy among males and about 2.5 years longer than that among females. Latino communities, particularly along the migrant stream and in the barrios in the Southwest, approximate the same inner city conditions as do black communities elsewhere. Okay, so you got this massive appropriation of potential wealth from certain targeted sectors of society going to shore up a particular order of doing business in this country. And it's been a phenomenon which has intensified steadily since the Vietnam adventure put everything in a tailspin for the powers that be, if you will. But even at that, the U.S. has continued to experience a steady decline in relative economic power globally, a circumstance which suggests these sorts of trends will continue, not only continue, but likely escalate before the end of the 90s. And needless to say, the natives grow restless under such circumstances. Okay? Further, as the ghetto risings and other phenomena of the 1960s have revealed, peoples of color, blacks in particular, possess not only a capacity to inflict considerable material damage in the expression of discontent at the lot assigned them within the U.S. social order, they actually hold a genuine and discernible potential to destabilize the order itself. That's a capacity. It's not that we were necessarily overly close to it in the 60s, but the message got through. Okay, in the bright minds of Washington being what they are, it was readily understood that things which get destabilized tend to fall down. Right? That's a specter that confronts the power elite, to use C. Wright Mills' term, in this country, and has been a specter confronting them, perhaps stalking them in their dreams ever since. Okay? Hence, a particular sort of social repression was and is necessary, given that what is at issue is a means of containing what U.S. elites have experienced and continue for very good reasons to expect to be outright insurgencies. And that's really what the ghetto rebellions of the 60s were. This is insurgency, uprising. It is fitting that both the concepts and the operational methods they have developed to meet this threat be viewed in terms of counterinsurgency warfare techniques. Ultimately, these are the real motivations and means of the war on drugs. This takes us to a particular theme I'd like to explore with you here tonight. It concerns certain of the origins of the present, quote, drug epidemic in the inner cities, end quote, as official sources like to call it, and the role of government policies and specific federal agencies in creating that epidemic. It addresses how many of the methods now employed in fighting the war on drugs were actually perfected in a somewhat different context 20 years ago, a little more than that as well, and how this fits in to a much longer-term program of containing and controlling the aspirations of communities of color in the United States. Through such examination, I hope to illuminate a number of little-considered dimensions, not only of the war on drugs, but of the functionings of power in the United States more generally. A cautionary note, we're not going to get to everything. For everything that I said, there's probably 20 times as much information readily accessible, and much more than that that's less readily accessible that's going to be left out. Okay, we're getting a bit of a summary here, not an exhaustive analysis, and certainly not exhaustive in terms of the deployment of detail. For purposes of simplicity, I would like to restrict consideration primarily to two entities. On the one hand, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and on the other, the Black Panther Party. Let's consider the Bureau first. Why does it exist? What is its function? We're all steeped in the standard mythology that the FBI is the nation's premier crime-fighting organization. Most of us have been exposed to the legend that the Bureau is composed of gangbusters. The image conjured up, and intentionally so, is that of a group of super sleuths protecting the citizenry from the minions of organized crime, giving big-time gangsters their just desserts. The problem here is that there is no evidence that the FBI ever busted any big-time gangster, and we've heard all the racketeers they supposedly cracked over the years, and they still put some of them up as pop-up targets in the firing range and take little kids down to watch the G-men knock them over with submachine guns. All the rest of that, you know the names, or probably you know some of them. John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson, Machine Gun Kelly, Alvin Karpus. The fact is that these were small-timers, by any estimation, rural bank robbers having more in common with the old Jesse James gang than with 20th century organized criminal behavior. None can be realistically assessed as having garnered more than $500,000 in the course of his criminal career. In fact, it can be amply demonstrated that such figures of Americana achieved their celebrity status primarily because of the extraordinary effort that the Bureau invested into publicizing them. The FBI likes to cast the impression that it was integrally involved with the demise of people like Al Capone. In actuality, it was the IRS. The Bureau points proudly to the fact that Louis Lepke Buchalter, the head of Murder Incorporated, surrendered to J. Edgar Hoover personally on the streets of Manhattan in 1938. In actuality, the surrender of Lepke was arranged by other mobsters, notably Lucky Luciano, because of heat being brought to bear by New York prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, and they wanted to take the heat off. Dewey was after Buchalter, so they said, hey, you got two choices. You give up, take the heat off us, or we'll kill you. Okay, he agreed. Lesser of two evils was to give himself up. Okay, gossip columnist Walter Winchell, who facilitated the surrender itself, had more to do with it than anyone in the FBI, including Hoover. The FBI's net haul of major figures in organized crime between the formation of the Bureau, roughly 1918, and the year 1980 is zero. Zero. Moreover, right up into the early 1960s, Hoover insisted publicly and vociferously that organized crime, whether it be called the Mafia, the Syndicate, the Organization, La Cosa Nostra, or what have you, and that's a quote from Hoover, does not exist. So much for gangbusters. As of 1971, analysis of documents removed by a citizens group from the FBI resident agency at Media, Pennsylvania revealed that only 1% of all Bureau resources were in any way devoted to combating organized crime, and that was mostly gambling. Another 10% went to dealing with interstate car theft. About 25% was focused on bank robberies, and the remaining 64% were allocated on other activities. Okay? So, of course, you have to ask the question, what were these other activities that claimed 2/3 of the Bureau's time and energy, resources in terms of cash, personnel, equipment, and everything else? Common denominator was that they involved various forms of intervention in the political life of American citizens. This is entirely consistent with the history of the FBI since its inception as the General Intelligence Division under the old Bureau of Investigation, which itself came under the Department of Justice, as the FBI does today. During the fall of 1918, the sole purpose of the new unit was to monitor the political activities of various citizens and non-citizens within the United States while planning what was to become known as the Palmer Raids, named after then Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, who hired J. Edgar Hoover to head up the unit. The Palmer Raids themselves were a nationwide sweep conducted in 1919, and I mean nationwide. I'm talking 50 major cities. I'm talking thousands of people involved in this, all right, which affected the warrantless arrest of tens of thousands of landed immigrants, mostly from Eastern and Southern Europe, who had not yet achieved citizenship status. The arrestees were herded together, matched with GID political intelligence files, and screened by interrogators. Those who could be shown to have orientation to anarchist, socialist, or communist ideologies were then summarily deported without hearing. The raids and deportations were the centerpiece of a broader campaign of repression undertaken in the midst of a highly propagandized governmental Red Scare, which shredded the virtual entirety of the U.S. left, notably the Communist Party, Communist Workers' Party, and industrial workers of the world. And with the IWW, you actually have this mass show trial that goes on in the name of justice in this country, where 101 of the leadership were tried on sedition charges all at once. They had to erect bleachers in the courtroom to hold the defendants because there simply wasn't space in any sort of a defense table. You got a mass trial. Sedition, for those who don't know, is specifically a thought crime. They were guilty of having illegal thoughts. That's what they were put on trial for en masse and ultimately sentenced to prison for. What we have here is a description of a national political police in the grand style. And as with any political police formation, its purpose was maintenance and preservation of the existing order, the socio-political and economic position of elites, in sum, the status quo. The targeted aliens were considered an ideological threat to American business as usual, no more. And it has been claimed by J. Edgar Hoover, among others, that the Palmer Raids were an aberration, an excess which the Bureau never repeated. Well, the record tells a different story. Even before the Palmer Raids were conducted, we find Hoover himself reporting on operations undertaken against Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican national who created and headed an organization known as the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, arguably the largest and most effective black liberation organization in U.S. history. UNIA's popularity among African Americans resided not only in the personal charisma of Garvey the man, but in his articulation of a vision calling for the establishment of black enterprises leading to economic self-sufficiency for black people and the utilization of this base to assert more general rights of self-determination for that community. More to the point than Garvey's personal popularity was the fact that his program showed every signs of becoming successful. Obviously, this presented a very real threat to the U.S. status quo in which blacks were and are assigned specific functions in terms of providing a pool of surplus labor, that is to say, long-term unemployed, intended to keep wages and other costs of production at minimum levels. And that's to say, if you're a worker and you get too uppity, they can always fire you and replace you with an unemployed personnel that's primarily composed of blacks who will work for a cheaper rate. Or that's the idea of the thing, and that's the function that's served in a socioeconomic structural sense in the United States. Has been that way for more than 100 years. Should be no particular novelty. Consequently, in any event, we find Hoover writing as early as 1918 to the Attorney General explaining that the Bureau was expending substantial investigative energy in an attempt to discover some statutorily illegal activity in which Garvey was engaged. Unfortunately, he said, no evidence of this has been forthcoming. However, he went on, if we play our cards right, this is a paraphrase, it's not a direct quote, it may be possible to make him appear guilty of some offense. So they kept at it for 7 more years without let-up. Finally, in 1925, they come up with a very tenuous stock fraud case. The man is tried, convicted, sentenced to 7 years. The Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, released after 2, deported permanently from the United States. Okay, sound fair? This is the very period, remember, when Joe Kennedy and the boys were doing their funny little pyramid games on Wall Street, and you would do well to consider governmental response to them. Kennedy, as I believe, was hired by the Treasury Department after the nature of his activities became generally known, to explain to the feds how to write laws so that no one would ever be able to do what he had done again. That was his punishment. After that, they made him ambassador to Great Britain. Okay. Okay, the fact that he was sent straight to a maximum security prison in Atlanta is something you might also want to compare to the recent 2-year stint of Ivan Bolsky, Ivan $200 million ripoff Bolsky, in a minimum security facility where he waxed floors and taught tennis in Southern California. Okay, he's out. He's out. With the removal of its leader, of course, UNIA rapidly disintegrated, thus saving U.S. elites from the specter of African Americans asserting any sort of meaningful control over their own lives and collective destiny. For his part, Hoover went on record in private communications vowing to never again allow a black man to gain the power and prestige that had been attained by Marcus Garvey. And so it went. The FBI was involved up to its neck in the breaking of railroad and steel strikes and combating the bonus army during the 1920s, suppressing the participation of communists and other, quote, subversives, end quote, in the federal works programs in the 30s, and destroying the participation of the Socialist Workers' Party in the Teamsters Union during the early 40s. Something that I understand that Sheehan was talking about the other night, that this has been pretty well tacked down, how they did it, not only with the Teamsters, but with the Longshore Union and so forth, and with interactions with this non-existent mafia group out there to keep things under control. This particular thing with the Socialist Workers' Party led to the rise of Jimmy Hoffa, which of course means Beck, Dave Beck, and Fitzsimmons, and this whole sort of interface between the Teamsters Union, the siphoning off of its pension fund to finance a whole range of mob activities over the years. And it's a situation which continues to, shall we say, hamper America's largest union, specifically as a result of FBI activities directed for political reasons at a particular group of people who were doing something rather different with the union in the early 1940s. Now we can go on into the second Red Scare, which is usually referred to as the McCarthy period, and we find the agency, the FBI, conducting tens of thousands of security investigations, and pushing people out of work and so forth because of their ideological propensities, not because they're accused of any specific crime whatsoever. And you also find the fabrication of criminal cases against key political targets of the period, targets which made the rest of it make some sense in terms of the FBI methodology, such as Alger Hiss and Sobel and the Rosenbergs and so forth. On the Rosenberg case, I understand that now Joe Stalin is supposedly on record, so Gary Will informs us as having said that they were good friends of his. Be that as it may, the case is still fabricated, and it is possible, for the record, to frame someone for something they actually did. Okay? It's not exactly due process, even if the party is guilty, if the evidence is fabricated by which they are convicted. And I'd like to just stand on that because I don't know enough about what Stalin's alleged to have said or what Khrushchev's alleged to have said about their relative guilt or innocence. It doesn't matter in the sense that they were framed. In 1954-55, all of this congealed in a top-secret undertaking cryptonymically dubbed COINTELPRO, a designation standing for Counterintelligence Program. And that may seem a little bit mysterious why they're suddenly coming up with what they're calling a new program, and it's a secret program when they've been on public record as having a counterintelligence division within the Bureau really since very first day. Counterintelligence is one of their primary missions, but counterintelligence in the normal sense and in the authorized sense, since the FBI had a charter and a mandate to pursue it, was directed against foreign agents. Okay, espionage agents, saboteurs, and other dangerous characters acting in the interests of foreign power. Okay, what COINTELPRO did was take that, at least legally legitimate function, and sort of secretly fuse it to another rather lesser known entity within the Bureau called the Internal Security Section. And its business was dealing with the political beliefs and political activities of U.S. citizens who held certain perspectives objectionable to the status quo. Now, the fusion is very interesting because what it says is that structurally, formally, officially, institutionally at that point, from that moment on, the FBI is going to utilize those methods which it has a legitimate right under the U.S. law to use against foreign agents, against citizens themselves. Well, the terms and conditions of operations in counterintelligence against foreign agents is that anything goes. Your function is not to obtain an arrest or haul someone before a court, charge them with offense, obtain a conviction, put them in prison or anything else. It is, in the vernacular of the trade, to neutralize them, to destroy their ability to function. And if that means you destroy them, fine. Fine. Mission accomplished. But in so many words, what they're saying is that we're going to take an operational motif which says you obliterate your opposition and we're going to apply it to the citizenry at large. Being politically objectionable in the United States from this point onward becomes essentially an invitation to the FBI to eliminate you, one way or another. Constitutional protections are not necessarily extended to foreign nationals under U.S. law. They are supposedly extended to U.S. citizens. That's the reason for the thing being secret. It was, under the Constitution and a number of federal statutes, entirely illegal. And it's important to understand that we're not talking about technical sorts of illegalities here, okay? COINTELPRO employed a range of tactics, beginning with such things as infiltration of agents provocateurs to disrupt and sow discord within targeted organizations. It also employed massive and systematic disinformation through a variety of means, extending from the mass media to anonymous or forged letters, bogus publications, and word of mouth to misrepresent and discredit targeted groups before the public, as well as inter and intra-organizationally. It utilized various means to disrupt marriages as well as other personal relationships. It deliberately caused people to be fired from their jobs, prevented their employment elsewhere, brought about their eviction from apartments, often through the intentional spreading of false information about them. It mailed or phoned countless death threats to those it considered key activists. It sponsored campaigns of baseless arrests with no intent to engage in prosecution, solely for purposes, and this is in their own words in their internal documents, of tying up activists in the legal process, exhausting their own and hopefully their organization's financial resources in bail and pretrial legal defense. In other words, to bankrupt their targets and thereby, quote, put them out of business, end quote. And this with no accusation of criminal behavior whatsoever. The whole purpose of COINTELPRO at this level was to frustrate, intimidate, or otherwise convince targets that the cost of dissident political expression was too high, that the better part of valor lay not in necessarily in open support of the status quo, but that at least valor lay in becoming apolitical. This was done in one way or another and to various extents to perhaps 250,000 U.S. citizens engaged in no illegal activities whatsoever, but were in fact exercising constitutionally protected rights of free speech, assembly, and other modes of political expression during the 1960s alone. In terms of disinformation funneled through the mass media, surely the bulk of the population was affected. No means has ever been found to measure the deformity of American political life and consciousness engendered by the state-sponsored and forcible truncation of political ideas and dialogue engendered by COINTELPRO. I mean, there's just no way you can't come up with a quantitative method of establishing what the impact of this thing was. But there is more, and there's actually much more. In instances where particularly effective political deviants, as Hoover liked to call them, refused to be deterred by COINTELPRO's standard arsenal of techniques, the FBI's counterintelligence specialists escalated. Homes and organizational facilities were ransacked and wrecked, money stolen, equipment broken, Gangs or vigilante groups were employed as surrogates to inflict physical punishment, sometimes death, upon the recalcitrant. Alternatively, phony political organizations were started to accomplish the same purpose, or bona fide dissident groups were duped into shooting wars with targeted organizations. Numerous criminal cases were fabricated in order to obtain long prison sentences for those who refused to back off. And in a frightening number of instances, the Bureau and cooperating state or local police personnel simply murdered those they couldn't silence any other way. And that's not an overstatement, as we'll see a little further on. Although COINTELPRO began its operational life by targeting first the Communist Party, then the Socialist Workers' Party, and other such time-honored targets, it rapidly shifted emphasis with the rise of the civil rights movement during the early 1960s. Shortly, we find Hoover returning to his Marcus Garvey theme, stipulating in an internal memorandum circulated to 23 field offices that a primary objective of COINTELPRO should be to, quote, prevent the rise of a black messiah, end quote. And he meant that in terms, as he spelled out, as being any individual capable of galvanizing the African American population, politically. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Stokely Carmichael are named as individuals who might potentially have fulfilled this role. Agents were instructed to devise, and again I'm quoting, imaginative, hard-hitting programs to neutralize these individuals and others like them. Malcolm X was assassinated soon thereafter, ostensibly as part of a factional dispute within the black Islamic community. A January 22, 1969 FBI memorandum, however, essentially takes credit for this outcome and goes on to suggest comparable operations be directed against other black nationalists. Dr. King was assassinated next under circumstances involving FBI complicity, at least to the extent of covering up by whom and how and why he was killed. And that's a conclusion not of a radical author or researcher out here, but of a congressional committee. At about the same time, Carmichael was driven into exile, the victim of an FBI bad jacket, which is a particular counterintelligence technique to make someone who's a bona fide activist appear to be something else, like an infiltrator. They usually use infiltrators to put bad jackets on people. So you have this interesting situation within movements, within organizations, where infiltrators are casting the real activists as being infiltrators and bringing about their expulsion or their political neutralization. Well, this is what was done to Stokely. He was portrayed as a CIA operative through the planning of a goldenrod copy of a dummied-up informant report to that agency. And there's a little interesting interagency dynamic that goes on, as the CIA personnel always want to make these guys look to be FBI infiltrators, and the FBI returns the favor by making them out to be CIA plants, okay? Okay, this is followed up by a series of anonymous telephone calls to his mother warning her that he was to be executed as a traitor by a number of his erstwhile political colleagues, okay? That's the big three that were named as being a potential black messiah. 2 dead and 1 driven completely out of the country. Meanwhile, the Bureau was directly involved in a much wider pattern of repression of the civil rights movement. For instance, one of its contract employees, Gary Rowe, this is just one guy now, assisted in the planning of and actually participated in the axe-handle beatings of freedom riders during 1962 and 63, was accused on fairly good evidence, was never convicted of it, but was accused of personally murdering an Afro-American demonstrator in 1963, is known to have helped plan the 1963 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, resulting in the deaths of 4 black children, and was in the Ku Klux Klan vehicle from which the bullets were fired, which killed organizer Viola Riuzzo in 1965, and the guy was taken to trial by the state of Mississippi several years later and accused of having actually fired a bullet. Now, the whole time this is going on and he's doing these things, he's working for the FBI. He's on the payroll. According to FBI COINTELPRO chief William Sullivan, he was assistant director of the Bureau at the time, in his autobiographical account, the Bureau, his agents, this is Sullivan's agents, had achieved complete control over the Mississippi Ku Klux Klan chapter by early 1964. More than 300 bombings and 10 murders are attributed to that chapter in the 2 years following. This is when the assistant director in charge in the FBI is saying, he and his guys have control of the Klan. So now who's responsible? Despite such efforts, the Bureau was plainly losing ground in its war against what was becoming a full-fledged black liberation movement by 1967. What they called the long, hot summers of the mid-1960s had thoroughly demonstrated the magnitude of black rage generated by systemic oppression in America, as well as the fact that their concentration in the country's inner cities gave them a strategic position from which they might deeply wound the U.S. Worse, from the establishment point of view, new organizations were emerging in the wake of Stokely Carmichael's and H. Rap Brown's calls for black power, which threatened to channel the massive force of African American anger in a truly focused and revolutionary direction. Fundamental social change was becoming a distinct possibility. This was especially true in the context of the times when the ability of the status quo to maintain itself was being severely tested by the material demands and social divisiveness induced by the Vietnam War. Okay, that's a situation. Enter the Black Panther Party. And many researchers have been mystified, really mystified, unable to explain why it was that as of September 1968, J. Edgar Hoover comes out publicly and says, Black Panther Party, 300 people, are the most significant internal security threat confronting the nation. Bar none. The assessment corresponds neatly, however, with his designation of the group for top priority COINTELPRO attention. Most commentators have accepted that his articulation as to the magnitude of the menace posed by the Panthers came because he actually believed, however erroneously and in whatever overinflated terms, the contents of the Bureau's own ensuing saturation campaign through the media designed to malign and discredit the Panthers before the public, this is to say, casting the party as an irrationally violent, or at least violence-prone entity, particularly with regard to the police. Okay? The public was rapidly conditioned to believe this, and therefore, by and large, to accept that whatever happened to the party and its members was richly deserved. But the record indicates that while the public may have been convinced, Hoover was not. He, unlike the population at large, was aware of the facts, which are these. During the 3-year period in which this whole drumbeat of publicity about the Panthers, the violent Panthers, cop-hating Panthers, the white-hating Panthers, all the rest of the things that are attributed to them in the press. During that peak period, which runs 1968 to 1970, somewhere between 30 and 40 members of the party, many of them unarmed, were killed by police. During the same period, there has been absolutely no documented case in which a Panther killed a cop. Not one. Not one. That's up through 1970. Now, after 1970, as you move into 1971, this changes a little bit. This experience engenders a change, and we see the emergence of the Black Liberation Army, convinced that there is no way you can survive in community programs and above-ground political activity under this kind of beating. And the police finally, through the elimination, the physical elimination of Panthers, produced the result they've been saying was there all along. Okay. And we can get into that further in questions and so forth. I don't really want to pursue it right now. Internal FBI documents, moreover, make little other than pro forma mention of supposed Panther violence. They just don't talk about it. They always say the violent Panthers, and then they go right on into what's really on their minds. Instead, the director and his strategists appear mainly concerned with the party's 10-point program for asserting community control, self-determination, as the Panthers called it, over inner cities through self-help, self-sufficiency, and the inculcation of self-esteem. And that black Americans were responding quite favorably to such ideas. Evidence of this last is that Panther membership swelled during 1968, now 1 year, from approximately 300 to 5,000. And the base of their community support during that period could be measured in the hundreds of thousands, and it was evident to Hoover and the rest of the people in position to have a need to analyze this, this was the case. Visions of a reborn UNIA must have been dancing through the director's mind. Hence, we find him secretly but specifically targeting for destruction the party's much heralded Breakfast for Children program. Now there's a heavy violent activity for you, okay? And threatening disciplinary action against FBI personnel who suggested that the feeding of hungry grade schoolers was hardly a capital offense. The way this is handled is indicative of the whole, okay? Hoover claims that his reason for his position, aiming all of this at the Breakfast for Children program, is because the Panthers are using the breakfast program to bring these kids in, hold a captive audience, and indoctrinate them in an ideology of hate. That's what he calls it. problem is he can't uncover any evidence that this in fact is true. None. And there's a lot of agents out there who do not share the belief that maybe Panthers are doing some good work here and you should leave them alone. There's a lot of them sharing Hoover's view. They want to crush the thing. So they're really genuinely trying to develop some evidence that this is an evil program. They can't do it. So they use an infiltrator in Sacramento who designs a coloring book, an off-the-pig coloring book, as they called it, an anti-white coloring book. I mean, it's a monstrosity. It truly is. The guy's working for the FBI. The coloring book is submitted to the Education Committee of the Black Panther Party, where it is rejected as being not reflective of the Panther viewpoint, at which point the FBI has to come in with the infiltrator and subsidize the production of the book nonetheless, and the guy begins to distribute it to the children. Bobby Seale, who's national chairman of the party, finds out about this and immediately does three things. One is he impounds all the books that they can lay hands on and stops the distribution. Two, he expels the guy who's responsible, the infiltrator, from the party. And three, he actually sends out cadres on the street, door to door, to people's houses to try to recover the ones that have been disseminated already, to get them back out of their hands. Nonetheless, Hoover uses this, and it's still used by the FBI from time to time, as evidence that the Panthers were teaching hate in the Breakfast for Children program. Ways in which information is manipulated and proofs presented to you that certain facts which aren't really are. Standard COINTELPRO stuff. Similarly, methods were employed in attacking Panther education programs, community clinics, adult food distribution projects, and job placement activities. Most directly related to this evening's topic is the fact that the party had a strong anti-drug position, especially vis-a-vis heroin. And this was coupled to a policy of physically driving dealers out of black neighborhoods and an embryonic attempt to establish autonomous alternative, or at least alternative in terms of posing some alternative to methadone treatment, okay, for a drug rehabilitation program. Although seldom remarked upon in subsequent histories and analysis, this effort also came in for special, one might say especially virulent, COINTELPRO targeting. The reasons for this was that the Panther anti-drug campaign, which was gathering considerable momentum by early 1969, was unwittingly running head-on into a major and still ultra-secret multi-agency government strategy to quell the black rebellion once and for all. The tool to be used for this purpose was drugs. Now, the matter ties back to, again, I think probably Dan Sheehan. I haven't heard his presentation, but he's talked about this at length and in depth before. I've heard him. A lot of what I'm drawing on, he developed. Okay, the matter ties directly to the war in Indochina, more specifically, the CIA's secret war in Laos. Okay. Ground war in this area of operations was conducted largely by an irregular force of Hmong troops assembled by the agency and led by a guy named Vang Pao. Major problem was how to fund this extremely expensive operation in an off-the-books sort of way. As Ron McCoy has shown in a book called, for those of you who are interested, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, as well as Daniel Sheehan and others, the question was resolved in 1968 by on-site CIA officials such as Thomas Kleins and Theodore Shackley, and undoubtedly approved on high. This was quietly enter into a business venture with Vang Pao with approval. Remember that. They couldn't just make this up and implement this thing on their own. It had to be approved straight down the line. They entered into the business venture with Vang Pao, wherein his troops would harvest a significant portion of the annual opium crop in the more proximate portions of the Golden Triangle region, which is the primary opium poppy growing area in the Annamese Cordillera. The raw opium was refined into heroin in facilities underwritten, at least in part, with agency funds. CIA transportation assets such as Air America were then employed to export the heroin in massive quantities. The revenues were then utilized to pay for portions of the Laotian effort, as well as to establish CIA contingency fund, with which other clandestine operations might be financed in William Casey's particular jargon, off the shelf. I think Oliver North got that from him. A major question here is where the heroin went to. Okay, they're shipping it out of Southeast Asia by the plane load. In 1968, the drugs of choice in American cities were marijuana and hashish, a concentrated derivative. Almost from the moment he entered office as president in January 1969, Richard M. Nixon undertook what might be described as a prototype of the present war on drugs. His express targets were marijuana and hashish. He virtually sealed off the U.S.-Mexico border for several months as an expedient to, quote, shutting off the flow of these illegal substances, end quote. By midsummer, something of a marijuana famine was sweeping the counterculture of the United States. Simultaneously, the inner cities were being inundated in a veritable flood of high-quality Southeast Asian heroin. Again, you don't have to be Einstein to put two and two together, okay? The government appears to have accepted at face value the Panther axiom that those who spend their time nodding out on smack can't possibly function as activists or much of anything else. The equation here for both sides is that the more junkies in the ghettos, the fewer the ghetto rebellions, or any other political activity for that matter. Obviously, for such a broad domestic pacification program to be maximally effective, entities such as the Black Panther Party would have to be surgically eliminated. Again, the theoretical construct involved is that of counterinsurgency warfare, which is really a subset of what Sheehan was talking about, as I understand it, in low-intensity warfare. Okay. Well, some of the methods used are very instructive in terms of the way they go about the war on drugs now, and other things which are related. So I want to deal with several examples in a bit of length, and then we'll wrap up. And I don't know if I'm going to get done within 1 hour, but I'll get done within an hour and 15 minutes, judging from the clock. First example has to do with just using arbitrary methods to eliminate the leadership of the party, to decapitate the party is the way they described it. The Eldridge Cleaver was Minister of Information of the Black Panther Party and perhaps its most able communicator. Author of the celebrated book Soul and Ice and an editor of Ramparts magazine, Cleaver was also a parolee from San Quentin. On April 6, 1968, which some of you may recognize as being the night, well, he was killed during the day, but the day of Martin Luther King's assassination, on that evening. Okay. Cleaver was with a group of Panthers who were accosted by a large force of police alongside a residential street in Oakland, California. A firefight resulted, during which Cleaver, unarmed even in the police accounts, took refuge along with another party member, 17-year-old Lil Bobby Hutton, in a crawl space of a nearby house. The two were tear-gassed and called upon to surrender, which they did. They were then stripped naked. Hutton was apparently told to run for his life. In any event, he died, unarmed, with several police slugs in his back. For his part, Cleaver was taken directly to jail on no specified charges whatsoever, simply as a parole violator. They didn't say what his violation was. Shortly, he was ordered by the California Adult Authority to resume serving his prison sentence, although it was not established that he had engaged in any illegal activity. An emergency appeal was filed by Attorney Charles Gary challenging the state's right to revoke parole without cause. The judge who heard the matter, Raymond J. Sherwin, then entered an opinion which bears quoting here, okay? Because I think it's just as true now as it was then, and the response that's going to come after it is very germane in a period of simply exploding penal system. What the judge said was this: it has to be stressed that the uncontroverted evidence presented to this court indicated that the petitioner had been a model parolee. The peril to his parole status stemmed from no failure of personal rehabilitation, but from his undue eloquence in pursuing political goals, goals that were offensive to many of his contemporaries. Not only was there absence of cause for the cancellation of his parole, it was a product of a type of pressure unbecoming, to say the least, to the law enforcement paraphernalia of the state. Okay? I think that about sums it up. Sherwin ordered Cleaver released from Vacaville prison on bond pending outcome of an urgent appeal of his decision by the Adult Authority to the California Supreme Court. The High Court, refusing to hear any evidence in the matter, reversed Sherwin on the basis that courts have no authority over the penal system and ordered Cleaver back to prison. He then went into exile, first in Cuba and then in Algeria, and creates an awkward circumstance. The party's getting fragmented, okay, and by its own, there's massive documentation of this. That's precisely the situation the FBI utilizes then to exacerbate the circumstances, creating factionalism, which leads to the disintegration of the party from the inside. Okay, and I think it's also kind of important to note before going on to the next example that the police action on the street in Oakland, which precipitated this whole sequence of events, occurred in the immediate aftermath of a meeting between Oakland Police Department Panther Squad Commander Ray Brown, who becomes a parole board member hereafter, okay? And he's one deciding whether Panthers get back out on parole. The Panther Squad Commander Ray Brown on the one hand, and San Francisco Special Agents William Cohindit and Charles Gain of the local COINTELPRO section on the other. So this was not just a local police operation. Okay, another example, same kind of thing. Party chairman Bobby Seale was charged more or less simultaneously by federal authorities with having conspired with 7 white activists, most of whom the government admitted they were completely unknown to him, of inciting a police riot during the 1968 Democratic Convention. Now that boggles the imagination, how exactly the chairman of the Black Panther Party can incite the police force of the city to do anything at all, never mind have a riot. But a police riot is what the specific government report which investigated it described the whole circumstances be. So I guess they were accusing Seale of being in command of the police for a period of time in Chicago. Okay. He was also charged during this period, slightly before actually, by the state of Connecticut with murder conspiracy in connection with the death of a Panther recruit named Alex Rackley in New Haven. Okay. Overall, these charges resulted in his being jailed for 23 months, 9 of it in solitary confinement without bond. More than $1.5 million in party funds were ultimately expended in his legal defense. In the end, the riot conspiracy charges were simply dropped, and a jury was unable to reach a verdict in the Rackley matter. Those charges, too, were then dismissed. As it turned out, the major actor in the murder of Alex Rackley was an FBI infiltrator named George Sams. Okay? 2 years downtime for the chairman of the party. He retires shortly thereafter. Lopping off the head. Next example. 21 members of the New York chapter of the party, including the entire leadership of that chapter, were charged in 1969 with conspiring to blow up the botanical gardens, several department stores, and certain police facilities, apparently using an assortment of empty aerosol cans impounded as evidence. That's the only evidence they really came up with. These guys had anything that could blow up anything. I'm not sure an aerosol can's quite up to taking out the botanical gardens, but that was the case. Okay. 13 party members were held under $1 million bond each, very dangerous characters, these aerosol cans, for nearly 2 years until the longest conspiracy trial in U.S. history up to that point had been completed. At that time, they were acquitted by the jury, which deliberated less than an hour in the matter, of 156 out of 150 charges levied against them, but 2 years apiece in lockup waiting for that result. And if you look at it for 10 seconds as a rational human being, you see it's a perfectly insane case. Okay, gets a little uglier now. This was the gentle stuff. In Los Angeles, COINTELPRO specialist Richard Wallace Held dreamed up the idea of sparking a, quote, shooting war, end quote, between the Panthers and a cultural nationalist organization known as United Slaves. Held caused a series of viciously derogatory cartoons to be produced, attributed to each group, has each group ridiculing the other, and then has these cartoons distributed within the communities where both targeted groups are attempting to organize and recruit. Okay? A result. On January 17, 1969, members of United Slaves shoot to death Los Angeles Panther leaders John Huggins and apprentice Bunchy Carter in a classroom at UCLA, Campbell Hall. The next day, Held reports to headquarters on this successful, his word, operation, and recommends that given these favorable results, again his words, a new batch of cartoons be prepared and distributed. A result. On May 23rd, Panther John Savage shot to death in San Diego by United Slaves gunmen. The next day there is another exchange between Held and headquarters in which the former takes credit and the latter approves yet another round of cartoons. Result? August 14, Panther Sylvester Bell gunned down by United Slaves members on a San Diego street corner, and the process is repeated. Final known tally is on a scorecard prepared by the Bureau and distributed with attribution to United Slaves. It reads, us 6, Panthers 0. Now, at least one participant in coordinating the hit squads that were involved in this was Claude Hubert, a known FBI infiltrator. At last report, Hubert was living in South America. Meanwhile, bona fide United Slaves members who participated in the killings, such as the brothers, George and Joseph Steiner, were subsequently convicted and sentenced to life for murder, so they're kind of on ice and out of the way. Thoroughly and understandably discredited within its own community as a result of its members' actions, not to mention the infiltrators' actions, United Slaves collapsed as an effective organization by 1971, and because of these hammer blows and numerous others undertaken by Held's COINTELPRO team in cooperation with the local Red Squad, the LA Panther organization was also destroyed as a viable political force by the latter year. The demise of these two major black political entities within the Southern California community opened the way for the growth and consolidation of a rather different group, one against which the FBI can be shown to have directed no particular counterintelligence attention. Known at the time as Common Revolution in Progress. Anybody know what I'm going to say next? Think about what the first letters of those words. Crips. More generally recognized today by the acronym CRIPS, an organization which becomes, by all estimations, a primary drug importation and distribution enterprise in the Southern California region. So the politicos are being suppressed. You could say that the FBI is imposing certain disincentives to socially constructive activities and political engagement. You could say there was a bit of an incentive allowed for people to engage in socially destructive participation at the same time. There is a cause and effect relationship that's going on here. As for Held, he went on to play a leading role in the frame-up of LA Panther leader Geronimo Pratt, successor to Carter in this capacity, the neutralization of white Panther supporters like Gene Seberg, and the establishment of a Minuteman-type paramilitary organization dubbed the Secret Army Organization, aimed at physical suppression of the Southern California left in toto. The story of SAO violence and the FBI's coordination and funding of its activities is a matter of public record. Okay, Held. He did these things. They're pretty much on record. He even acknowledged them. He turns the cartoons that we're talking about earlier, comes out in the San Francisco Chronicle a little later on, well, quite a little later on, about 2 years ago, in fact. Yeah, I admit I was involved in a sophomoric campaign of putting out these bogus cartoons of the Panthers and us. Now, if 6 Dead is sophomoric in this guy's mind, you might wonder what he's going to do when he gets serious about things, okay? But in any event, at the end of this period, he was rewarded for his services by being promoted special agent in charge of the San Juan field office, that's in Puerto Rico, during the late 1970s. And in 1985, coordinated as the overall commander, in fact, of the largest anti-subversive sweep since the Palmer raids. This was directed against the independence movement on that island. Okay, this kind of rolls up the independentistas for a little while. Makes the Bureau very happy, so they reward him again. He's now posted as a special agent in charge of the San Francisco field office. He's in the Bay Area. And very interestingly, okay, he's a bit double-hatted because he also serves as the Bureau's West Coast specialist and primary spokesperson on the war on drugs. Okay. And I might add that it was originally planned that this session not be me standing here running all this down to you by myself. It was originally planned to be a debate between myself and Richard Wallace Held. Okay. This was approved, and I personally invited him, expenses paid, to come here and talk about it. He accepted, and then withdrew when it became apparent that we would talk about COINTELPRO in relation to his present activities, and that he's not about to come out in public and talk about. Okay. Richard Wallace Held, Richard W. Held. You can reach him at the San Francisco field office. He's in every Tuesday afternoon. The rest of the time he's usually out hobnobbing. Okay. This is FBI. That's correct. Special agent in charge of the San Francisco field office. Okay, another example. In Chicago, the Black Panther Party was, in 1968, engaged in a series of negotiations with a huge South Side street gang, which had been known for quite a long time as the Blackstone Rangers. The idea was that the Rangers would abandon their criminal orientation, merging with the Panthers to establish the first real area of inner-city black autonomy in the country. That was the express intent. Indication of the direction that these things were going was that the Rangers redesignated themselves as being the Black Keystone Nation. Apparently desperate to forestall the wholesale shift from criminality to politicization. Among as many as 5,000 ghetto youth, FBI COINTELPRO specialists Roy Mitchell and Robert Piper hatched a plan, approved by the Chicago SAC, Marlon Johnson, and headquarters, to split the two groups. Their method was to write anonymous letters, ostensibly penned by what they call a black brother. That's how it's signed. Okay? These are two white agents. And mail them to Keystone leader Jeff Fort, warning that Panther leader Fred Hampton was playing him for a sucker and had in fact taken out a contract on his life. Okay. Now, I'll leave it to you how to interpret that for a moment, because there's sort of a little interesting caveat on it. In internal correspondence, the agents explained their thinking. The Keystone, they said, was an extremely violent organization which might be expected to retaliate against Hampton and the Panthers. How they were expected to retaliate is left unstated, but one suggests the example of the successes claimed in the United Slaves Panther War gives a fair indication. Now, Marlon Johnson, who was the special agent in charge who approved this, was called before a court and had to testify about it later on. And they asked him, you know, Agent Johnson, what's a contract for? I really don't know. It's an agreement between two gentlemen, he says. Well, it's a contract for a hit. What's your understanding of what's meant by a hit? Well, I was never quite clear on that, he says. Something nonviolent, I suppose. All right, this is his testimony. And this is a guy who runs the FBI office in the city of Al Capone, right? If you believe this one, I want to talk to you about some real estate transactions in a little bit. As it happened, Fort and his followers failed to rise to the occasion. While they permanently aborted their alliance with the Panthers, with consequences that are still going on today, there is no evidence that they attempted to assassinate Hampton. Thus, the Bureau had to arrange his death through other channels. As is well known, the medium used for this purpose was a special squad of state's attorneys' police coordinated by Piper and utilizing intelligence provided by FBI infiltrator William O'Neill. In the pre-dawn hours of December 4th, 1969, this group simply kicked in the doors of Hampton's apartment and shot him to death in his sleep. Also killed in the raid was Peoria chapter leader Mark Clark. There is considerable evidence, all right, more than enough for anyone to be comfortable with it, that O'Neill slipped Hampton a dose of secobarbital and a glass of Kool-Aid prior to the raid in order that he present a comatose and therefore stationary target for the raiders. On the same date as the murders of Hampton and Clark, Piper sent a report to headquarters taking credit for yet another success and recommending O'Neill be paid a bonus for his part in it. The bonus was paid. COINTELPRO architect Richard G. Held, who is the father of Richard W., was then reassigned to serve as SAC Chicago to orchestrate a decade-long cover-up of the FBI's role in the Hampton-Clark assassinations. The Chicago Panthers rapidly disintegrated in the wake of the assassinations. The Black Keystone Nation, on the other hand, went on to be transformed once again, this time into an entity known as El Rucan, alleged to have served until very recently as the mainstay of drug importation and distribution within Chicago's African-American community. Again, we have this cause and effect relationship. Knock the politicals out and you would use the drug importers, the criminal elements, who might otherwise become politicized, as a counter in the struggle to do it. In other words, what the Bureau was saying is that they vastly preferred criminal enterprise in the inner cities as opposed to political programming. Examples of this sort could be continued almost indefinitely, but there is no time and hopefully no real need. Before moving on, however, I would like to point out that the spirit of these activities has been demonstrably carried forward long after the Black Panther Party ceased to exist as a coherent national political force and long after COINTELPRO itself was supposedly terminated in 1971. Here the example of Lincoln Detox is illuminating. This is a facility lodged within the Lincoln Hospital located in South Bronx, an extremely depressed black community with notoriously high rates of heroin addiction. Beginning about 1973, remnants of the New York Panthers and other radical organizations combined to launch a drug rehabilitation program within the hospital based in a combination of acupuncture techniques and the self-improvement model developed. This is a self-improvement based rehabilitation model developed by Malcolm X during the early 60s. By 1976, this effort was engendering what can only be described as phenomenal results. Recidivism of addicts treated within the program was shown to have been below the 30th percentile over a sustained period in this case being 2 years. No other drug rehab program in the nation could claim anything resembling these substantiated results, and I would submit to you there's no drug rehabilitation program in the nation right here as we speak tonight who can show you results like this. So what was the response of the state to this spectacular success story? Did the program receive the increased support to which one would assume it would be entitled from a government seriously interested in curbing drug abuse in the inner cities? Were plans made to replicate it elsewhere? No, you already know the answer. The FBI immediately began submitting reports that those working at Lincoln Detox had, quote, subversive histories, end quote, and ties to terrorist groups such as the Black Liberation Army and other underground organization. In 1978, all government funding to Lincoln Detox was canceled and its staff was itself evicted shortly thereafter. A standard methadone treatment program was then implemented, and it has subsequently exhibited the typical recidivism rates marking such programs, okay? Recidivism falling in the 70th percentile. Further, unlike those treated in the so-called radical program, people allegedly cured of heroin addiction through the methadone substitution are left entirely dependent on that substance, the only supplier of which is the government itself. And I would argue that's exactly the intent. So much is known. Also known is that the drug of preference and availability in the United States during the second half of the 1970s, after access to Southeast Asian heroin was drastically curtailed by the U.S. loss in Indochina, became cocaine. It is known that the CIA was involved during this period, in which George Bush served as CIA director, in establishing conduits of cocaine supply, primarily through the good offices of his friend Manuel Noriega in Panama. What is not known, in part because congressional investigators chose to keep portions of the Iran-Contra probe which dealt with this particular area secret. They took them off camera for that, and they have never released the complete results of the hearings that went in, is the full extent of CIA participation in moving cocaine into the U.S., the actual volume of that cocaine that came through the agency's channels, and exactly which among the various Colombian drug cartels has been the CIA's preferred supplier. However, to return once again to what is known, by the early 80s, the CIA had established a major cocaine transshipment operation in Costa Rica, functioning out of a ranch owned by a guy named John Hull, one of its long-term operatives in that country. The coke was marketed in U.S. cities, with the proceeds going partially, at least, to fund the CIA's off-the-shelf Contra war against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Hull left Costa Rica, where he is now under indictment for murder and drug trafficking. Shortly after the Oliver North, all of that, okay? Secord, Kleins, Shackley, they're all sort of tied up in a nice little package there. He split when that started to unwrap. He now resides peacefully on a farm in Indiana and is not, according to both the State Department and the DEA, the subject of any investigation. Okay? And this is true despite the fact that the government of Costa Rica has on 2 separate occasions attempted to secure his extradition as a drug trafficker and a murderer. Meanwhile, George Bush stands here with a straight face telling us it's necessary to conquer Panama in order to finally bring its dope dealer dictator to justice. And it is necessary and appropriate that the U.S. use economic and other forms of coercion to force the government of Colombia, and we could add Bolivia, important Peru, and here and there, to engage in low-intensity warfare against its own population in order to put some drug cartels out of business. If something seems wrong with the picture here, I don't think you're going to be able to fix it by simply adjusting the dial, okay? The picture snaps a little better into focus, though, when you look at it from a different direction. Let's abandon for the moment the official rhetoric about there being a war on drugs, and let's replace it with the title of this conference, Drug Wars. It's a descriptor I think bears altogether different and rather more accurate connotations. Instead of a war against drugs, we are confronted with a war over drugs. Or more correctly put, who controls the drug trade. Stated another way, what is going on right now seems to me to be a secret war conducted by the United States government to protect its own drug importation mechanisms against competitors which either already existed or have arisen since the early 1970s. Hence, we find certain Colombian cartels hit very heavily by the DEA and other dimensions of the U.S. community, while others have gone virtually unscathed. Or again, we find Manuel Noriega protected and empowered by the U.S. during a certain period and then obliterated by military force in another, when by all accounts he was doing exactly the same thing during both periods. So why was it right one time and wrong the next? Why do we have a moral mission to invade, kill 5,000 Panamanians? In order to bring this guy up here for what? For doing what we put him in a position to do in the first place, we being the U.S. government. Always makes me nervous to slip and say we in that connection. This is, of course, an entirely speculative interpretation of the available information, and I won't deny it. The government has hardly leapt up to confess, nor are there any smoking gun documents filtered out which could tack down the relative degree of truth or falsity in the proposition. But it can be said with certainty that such interpretation is quite consistent with earlier and well-substantiated initiatives undertaken by the FBI, CIA, and their colleagues, both official and nominally civilian. It is also worth noting that it makes at least as much sense as the utterly self-contradictory explanations on the drug wars trotted out by George Bush and drug czar William Bennett. And since we're speculating here, let's examine for a moment, before closing and going on to questions, exactly how this works internally within the United States itself. Let's use one of the more sensationalized examples offered by the government in promoting the need for the war on drugs. Bloody turf battle between the Crips and the Bloods in Los Angeles. There's one that saw current saturation for, 6 months? Every night, body counts. Let's suppose for a moment that the Crips are, as there is at least some evidence to suggest, a federally approved entity. Let's suppose further that it is, in fact, as have been a number of other organizations with even seamier criteria than this in the past, quietly controlled by infiltrators in key positions, a matter quite unknown to its general membership. Now let's also suppose that the Bloods are a competitive organization which has emerged organically from the community itself, and I think you get the drift of what's going on here. It's a near-perfect scenario from the counterinsurgency specialist point of view. The set of extreme disincentives which are created to steer target population's youth away from socially constructive political engagements, sitting there on the one hand, and a tacit set of incentives which are created to attract these same youth to socially destructive criminal activities within their own community. The tool of the trade is a substance guaranteed to induce even broader pacification within the target population. The activity even has the benefit of being quite profitable, profitable for the creators as well as the participants, the incentive aspect of it, making their effort essentially self-funding and allowing a cash surplus with which they can secretly experiment with other ventures in social engineering. Best of all, any contestation of the activities of their surrogates, role or position within the community thus dominated can be answered quite bloodily, viciously, any way they choose, for whatever purpose they choose, using only members of the target population itself as fodder. The situation which results will carry with it the appearance of a violent criminality on the part of the targeted population so massive and pervasive that it itself will call upon the counterinsurgents to openly intervene, thereby bringing in a whole new level of repression upon themselves. Like I said, it's a very nearly perfect script, and it took them a long time to work it out. To the extent that any of this is true, and documentably quite a lot of what I've had to say this evening is, it's gotten to be very late in the game. It goes without saying that it seems to me we need to engage in some fundamental rethinking as to the meaning and significance of the war on drugs, who's doing what to whom and why. More broadly, I think it's long past time to stop the endless debate about whether or not, if current trends continue, the U.S. is likely to become a police state. We've already been a police state for the last 25 years or more, in case anyone hasn't noticed, and all the statistical indicators are that it's getting much worse and very quickly. And we sit around debating whether it's likely to happen. Okay. Question is thus, what is to be done about it? And here I will state only that I see another fundamental rethinking as being necessary. By this, I mean that there must be a top-to-bottom reassessment by progressives of the Black Panther Party, its significance and the implications of the sort of community liberation programming it advocated and in some cases implemented, the appropriateness of its assessment of the American state and police apparatus, its conclusions on the need for physical defense of ourselves and our endeavors. This is not a call for the recreation of the party per se. Its mistakes were many, and we must learn from them. We must, however, do the job right this time, and as both Malcolm X and party head Huey P. Newton would have put it, by any means necessary. Such a struggle will be neither pleasant nor comfortable. There's no reason to expect it. No, there's just no reason to expect that it would be. It will, in fact, be quite dangerous and quite painful. The alternative, however, is far worse. And the longer we delay in coming to grips with our basic obligations in this regard, the worse it's going to become. In closing, then, allow me to say something which formed, in my view at least, and I think in a number of their views as well, the core of the Panther spirit, in which I've heard far too seldom in the last 20 years: all power to the people.